Well, thank you so much, Greg, for that introduction, and Alistair and Peter for hosting us here at the Institute. I'd also like to thank Ambassador Galego for inviting me to say a few words, and recognize also the support of Delmore Languier in our endeavors to build relations between Australia and Latin America. So it's a real honor to be here to speak for a few minutes. I'm not sure if it'll make any difference to me if it sells one copy or 50,000. In terms of royalties, I don't see any, because most of it goes to the publisher. But sure, I'm happy if people read what I've written anyway. I think this is a great place to give a talk, by the way, because it's one of the only places that I've ever given a talk where you can have a few drinks first. And I think that's a wonderful idea. I'm going to propose this at the University of Melbourne. I think we need to do a bit more of that, a bit of socializing as well. Look, as you can see from the title of the presentation, Cuba opens a door to the world. That's not, those aren't my words. These are the words that were given to us when we visited the Manuel Special Development Zone. And on the front of this brochure, Cuba opens a door to the world, a brochure about opportunities for Australian, for US one day, for European, for foreign firms to come and do business in Cuba, which I think is quite a fascinating development. Having lived in Cuba for 3 years and gone every year there for the past 15, I've never seen a brochure like this in Cuba. So this really does signal that a change is happening. What I take that to mean, those words, Cuba opens the door to the world, is really about mutual understanding. I think, as Greg said, the Cuban government and the Cuban health system, for instance, has been very active around the world for at least 30, 40 years. And the thing is, most people have got no idea about this. People don't know. There's a lack of knowledge. 4 years ago, we did a project. I had the good fortune of coming in as a consultant for AusAid on Cuba-Australian medical cooperation. And what we found the main issue was precisely this: a lack of knowledge about the quality of the Cuban medical system. And how can students who go to Cuba to study medicine and then return home become accredited to practice or to go on to do further study if their qualifications aren't recognized? And that was our main recommendation, that there needs to be a better effort at building understanding. And that's what I think this is about. Cuba opens a door to the world. It's really an invitation, I think, to try to start building knowledge. So I thought, when I went on the mission over the past, well, it was 3 weeks ago now with the minister, that should be our primary focus, to start learning about the opportunities that exist in Cuba. I, at the University of Melbourne, was invited to go along to look at research partnerships, to look at projects that we might start to collaborate on in Cuba. And so I want to say a few words about 2 projects that we've begun to now collaborate on. We've put in some funding proposals, we've developed some plans, and begun the process of working together. Now, I think there we are. So I want to just begin by mentioning this fellow here. This is someone that I've gotten to know over the past 15 years. I go and see him every year in Cuba because he gives me an insight into what everyday life is like for everyday Cubans. He was, at this point, maybe 3 years ago, selling plumbing equipment. He was part of the results of the opening of the domestic economy so that people could set up their own businesses through the process called the lineamientos, or the guidelines, that the Cuban government published about, 4 years ago now. So he started to do this. I've gone back every year to see him. This year it looked a bit different. He's sitting in the same place, but now he's selling fruits, vegetables, he's selling beans. And I asked him why the change? Why has he decided to change what he sells? He says, well, the Cuban government has got some very specific guidelines around urban food security, that it wants to promote urban food security. And that for this reason, people are encouraged to try to sell local produce at outlets like this around the city. So this is something that I found quite fascinating, and a couple of years ago I started to look into this, learned that there are about 300,000 urban garden plots around the country, and that 70% of all fresh vegetables consumed in Cuban cities are grown within those same cities. It's quite a remarkable figure. The Cuban Ministry of Agriculture uses now half of the diesel fuel than it did in 1989, and less than 10% of the chemical fertilizers, less than 7% of the synthetic insecticides that it used to. So I knew this was a priority. As we went on this mission, I started to think about what we might do to support this process. Of course, it didn't take long for me to recall that 17 years ago, 1999, AusAid funded a project right when Cuba was going through some difficult times. Withdrawal of the Soviet Union, they then had to deal with food shortages through the mid-90s, and AusAid had sent teams of permaculture trainers from here, from Melbourne, to go to Cuba and work with Cubans to share techniques, also to learn techniques. And that laid a foundation then for Cuba's urban agriculture program, which the Cubans immediately innovated on. Very good at innovating, and made their own, and now has resulted in these really impressive figures. But as I went around speaking with people 2-3 weeks ago in Cuba, and met people at the Ministry of Agriculture, they said, well, the situation is changing. We now need some support to look at soil contamination and air contamination. All of those pictures, like this picture of these old cars, right? They're running on diesel fuel, and that fuel gets into the air and lands on crops like these, and then people eat it. So air pollution and soil pollution from lead entering the soil is an issue. This is something that the University of Melbourne is a world leader on, soil analysis. So we've proposed this as a project with the Ministry of Agriculture. It's one of the 2 projects that we're now going ahead with as a result of this trade mission. I mean, I think there's a lot that we can learn as well about becoming less dependent on large-scale agribusiness, and especially in a context of climate change, making sure that our cities have sufficient food security. Another project that we looked at is related to mining, right? And thanks to the work of Ambassador Galego and Kim Pryor of the recently emerged Cuba-Australia Business Council, we were able to meet with the highest officials in the Cuban mining sector to look at opportunities for Australian companies. Now, nickel mining is the sector in which Cuba has most of its mining activity. It's also a sector in which Australia has worldwide expertise. And so it's logical then that we look at ways to cooperate. In fact, Australia has been working with Cuba in the nickel mining sector now for about 20 years. And Mrs. Pryor of the Australia-Cuba Business Council has been facilitating the sale of Australian mining equipment to Cuba for that amount of time. Now I, as a researcher at the University of Melbourne, thought, well, this will be interesting to learn about these mining projects, but it's probably not something that will be, for me, directly relevant. But I was mistaken, because in the room was the head of international cooperation from the Ministry of Culture. And he said to me, Adrian, the Ministry of Culture works with the Ministry of Mining. And I thought, well, how? How do you work with the Ministry of Mining? He said, well, remember, in Cuba, everything we think about in a social context. So what about the villages, the towns, the people that work in the mines? What can we do for them? How can we make sure that the impact of mining projects is favorable for the people that live around the mines? And he said, well, what tends to happen too often is that the people who work in mines on the weekends have got nothing to do. They get absolutely drunk and then either don't show up to work on Monday or show up not feeling that happy about their jobs. And what they need is more sense of engagement with the rest of the world. And he said, we've started up a project through what we call the Casas de Cultura, the culture houses, to bring musical acts and educational acts into mining towns. so that the mining communities also get a sense of human uplift, a sense of education, a sense of connection to the world. And so he said to me, why don't you look at putting together a project bringing Australian music to Cuba, and Australian education about music as well, Aboriginal music, Aboriginal musicians, something about the history of art, the history of music. So I started to think about this, and again, it didn't take me long to realize that at the University of Melbourne we have the School of Music, which is run by someone named Alex Pertu, who last year won the Grammys in Cuba. Amazing. His CD won the Cuban Cuba Disco. This is his disc, Alex and Lilusha, Alex Pertu, and this won the international first prize of the Cuban Grammys, the Cuba Disco Prize. And this is what the Director of International Collaboration at the Ministry of Culture said. He said, building culture and building business should go hand in hand. And I thought he's absolutely right. We need to do something about this. And so we went ahead and we've proposed a project with the Ministry of Culture that we've now begun planning to bring not only Australian musical groups and educational groups to mining villages in Cuba, but also Cuban groups to mining villages in Australia, mining towns. We thought this could be quite an interesting project. It's the kind of cultural exchange that I think really should accompany economic exchange. And I mean, it's not just me who seems to think so. As you saw there, this is the front cover of the latest Ernst & Young report on Cuba. Even Ernst & Young, right? International business consultants recognize the power of music in Cuba. So, I'm almost finished. I'll just come to the end. I should mention, before I finish, this place. This is Mariel, the Mariel Special Development Zone. This is the thing that's made the news, right? As Cuba opens its economy. This is where it wants to bring the investment to. This is the port of Mariel, which is being set up as a free trade zone, essentially. That's the delegation at the top, obviously, with Minister Robb. This is the strategic vision for Mariel, right? It will be the largest container port in the Caribbean. It has post-Panamax cranes. No other port in the Caribbean has those. What that means are cranes that can accommodate boats that go through the widened Panama Canal, the so-called post-Panamax boats, shipping lines, right? So this is looking like it could have real potential. This is what the Cuban government expects Mariel to look like. That's how they want it to develop. And you can see there on the map in the top right, this is not disconnected from the United States, right? The vision here is to set up a manufacturing hub that could have easy access to the United States market. For this reason, you have a number of manufacturers around the world now setting up there or looking at setting up there. One of them, just want to mention, is this. The Yutong Bus Company from China replaced these buses. It now builds the ones on top, alleviating the transport problems. They're looking at setting up a factory right there in the Mariel zone. For Australia, maybe it doesn't make as much sense since we sell mining equipment to Cuba rather than manufacture things, whereas the Chinese, you can see here, are now, as of last year, the #1 trading partner, as of last year, for Cuba, as they are for Australia, by the way. You can see the bilateral trade there. But the point is that Cuba is changing, and quickly. This is a picture I never thought I would see. Right? This is Rodrigo Malmierca, the Cuban Minister of Trade and Investment. I never thought I'd see him in the same room with Andrew Robb. But there he is, and that, by the way, is David Engel, our ambassador in Mexico City, responsible for Cuba. Three people, I've been studying what Malmierca does for years. Never pictured him in the same room with Andrew Robb. I think it's a good thing. I want to leave you with this picture. This is a park I always used to go to and sit. It was peaceful. It's not peaceful anymore. It's got hundreds of people. And if you look closely enough, what they're doing, if you can see what they're doing, just about everybody there is looking at the internet on their cell phone. Right? Cuba has often been criticized for not giving public access to the internet. Well, that is a thing of the past. Right? Cubans now, for $2, can buy 6 hours on the internet, and that's what people do in the public parks. Cuba is changing, and I think that's a good, maybe, vision to kind of sum up on, because it does, well, if that can happen, then anything can happen, I think, including in our relations here in Australia with Cuba. So I think I'll end there. Thanks.